The gavel was made of bone. That was the first thing Ambassador Vay Lauren noticed when they unsealed the chamber records, not the verdict itself, not the unanimous vote, not even the faces of the 7 species who had raised their hands. Just the gavel, carved from something pale and dense, sitting at the center of the presiding arbiter's desk like it had always been there. Vay Lauren had attended 312 council sessions. He had never once thought to ask what it was made of. He was thinking about it now. Because the humans had been gone for 41 years, and something had just crossed back through the threshold. It was not what anyone expected. It was not an armada. It was not a distress signal. It was a single vessel, unmarked, unregistered, broadcasting on a frequency the Council had officially retired when they scrubbed humanity from the Galactic Registry. The frequency still worked. Apparently the humans had counted on that. The message was 4 words. We are ready now. 41 years earlier, the chamber had been full. Every seat occupied, every species represented. Delegations packed 3 rows deep along the upper gallery, the air thick with translation static, and the particular tension that only exists when a room full of powerful beings has already decided what it's going to do but hasn't done it yet. The vote was a formality. Everyone understood this. What no one understood, what Vay Lauren, young then, serving his first term as a junior diplomatic observer, had spent 4 decades trying to understand, was why the humans had not argued. They had been given the floor, standard procedure. The accused species always received the floor before the final motion. The human representative, a woman named Dr. Alara Moss, had stood at the podium for 11 seconds without speaking. The translation arrays had cycled through 17 languages waiting for input. Then she had said, very quietly, "We understand." Not "we object," not "we appeal," not "we will comply under protest." "We understand." And then she had sat down. The vote passed unanimously. Humanity was stripped of council membership, expelled from all protected trade corridors, their colonial claims suspended, their embassy seals revoked. The official term was *provisional exile, with a review clause that everyone in the room privately agreed would never be invoked. A species that had been exiled once was never genuinely welcomed back. The Galactic Council had precedent for this. They had history. They had the bone gavel. What they did not have, what Vay Lauren was only now beginning to realize, was any understanding of what we understand had actually meant. The signal was still broadcasting when the emergency session convened. Vay Lauren stood at the edge of the chamber's outer ring, watching the delegations file in with the particular quality of agitation that looked like composure from a distance. He had learned to read the difference. The Dravathi kept touching the secondary joints of their midlimbs, stress response, involuntary. The Quas delegation had arrived wearing diplomatic neutrality robes instead of their standard observer's garb, which meant someone in their chain of command had made a deliberate decision about how this meeting would look in the record. The Sur Ethvel arbiter, Counselor Dihan, had not removed her travel coat. She had come straight from transit. She was the one who had cast the deciding vote 41 years ago. She sat down without looking at anyone. "One vessel," said Fleet Commander Rethanoa, pulling up the sensor data across the main display. "Mass consistent with a mid-range transport. No weapons signatures on any detectable spectrum. Life signs," he paused. 43 humans. We have confirmed identification on 6. "Who?" said Dihan. "That's the part I need to show you." He transferred the file. The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when everyone receives the same information simultaneously, and no one wants to be the first to react. Vay Lauren leaned forward to read his own copy. Of the 6 confirmed identifications, 4 were biologically impossible. The humans on that vessel included individuals who, according to council medical records from 41 years ago, had been in their late 70s. One had been documented as terminally ill at the time of exile. The files were unambiguous. The lifespans of the species were well understood. These people should not exist. Clones, said someone from the Drevathi delegation. Genetic match is exact, not copies, the same individuals. That's not, the Drevathi delegate started again. That's biologically inconsistent with. Yes, said Rethanoa, I'm aware. Vay Lauren was still staring at one name on the list. Dr. Alara Moss. Age at time of exile, 62. Current biological scan estimate from the sensors on the approach corridor, somewhere between 40 and 50. She hadn't aged. She had gotten younger. They docked in Corridor 7, the same berth where the human embassy ship had sat for 9 years before the exile, back when humanity had been merely a junior member species, and not yet a problem anyone had formally defined. Vay Lauren had been assigned to the receiving team, partly because of his seniority, partly because he was one of 4 council members who had actually met humans before. He stood at the end of the corridor in the cold, recycled air, and tried to remember what they had been like. Small, that was always the first thing. Smaller than expected for a species that generated such disproportionate documentation. Warm-bodied, fast-moving, with a quality of attention that other species sometimes found flattering and sometimes found threatening, depending on whether the attention was focused on you or on something behind you. The airlock cycled. The first human through was not Alara Moss. It was a young man, genuinely young, not biologically reversed, simply young, perhaps 30 years old, carrying nothing, wearing a dark suit that was not quite a uniform and not quite civilian clothing, and looking at the corridor the way you look at a place you've seen in photographs but never visited. Not awe, recognition. He walked directly toward Vay Lauren without hesitation, as though he'd been given a description and matched it on first glance. Ambassador Vay Lauren, he said. His translation chip was clearly newer than the ones the humans had used before exile. The rendering was cleaner, none of the tonal flattening. My name is Soren Moss. Dr. Moss would like to greet you personally, but she asked me to come first. A pause. She wanted to know if the chamber still uses the same gavel. Vay Lauren's secondary hearts did something they had not done in a long time. What do you know about the gavel? He said. Soren Moss smiled. It was not a comfortable smile. She said you'd ask that. She said to tell you she'll explain everything in the room. He glanced past Vay Lauren toward the corridor. Is the room the same room, the original council chamber? Yes. Good, she was specific about that. Behind him, the airlock finished its cycle, and the rest of the humans began to file through. 41 years was a long time. Vay Lauren kept finding himself doing the calculation involuntarily, the way you press a bruise to check if it still hurts. He had been a junior observer when humanity was exiled. He had risen through 3 levels of diplomatic seniority in the intervening decades. Species rose and fell during 41 years. Wars resolved. Technologies shifted. The Galactic Council itself had undergone 2 structural reforms and 1 near-dissolution event that was still officially described as an administrative reorganization. Humanity had been gone for all of it. Or so everyone had believed. The first sign that this assumption was wrong came 11 minutes into the walk from Corridor 7 to the main council chamber. One of the junior Quas delegates, young, probably in her first assignment, fell into step beside a human she didn't recognize and asked, in the carefully neutral tone of someone fishing for intelligence, whether the exile period had been difficult for the human colonies. The human, a tall woman with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of posture that suggested she'd spent significant time in low gravity, turned and looked at the Quas delegate for a moment before answering. "Which colonies?" she said. "You're the human colonial territories, in the Outer Rim. The ones listed in our registry expulsion. Those were abandoned within 6 months of the vote. We had to move fast." The woman smiled pleasantly. You should ask Soren about the new ones. He loves talking about infrastructure. She kept walking. The Quas delegate stopped moving entirely for 3 full seconds. Valoran noticed because he was watching everyone. The new ones. Humanity had been stripped of its colonial claims as part of the exile terms. Colonizing new territory would have required registration with the Council, registration they'd been legally barred from accessing. Unless they hadn't registered. Unless they'd spent 41 years building something the Council didn't know existed. The chamber was unchanged. This, Valoran thought, was perhaps the cruelest thing about it. The 7 tiers of seating arranged in their precise geometric formation, the translation arrays humming at standby frequency, the acoustic panels that damped sound above a certain emotional intensity, because the designers had anticipated that powerful beings sometimes got loud. And at the center of the presiding arbiter's desk, exactly where it had always been, the pale gavel. Dr. Ilara Moss walked in last. She was not what Valoran expected, even knowing what the bioscan had said. The numbers had prepared him for the physical fact of her survival. They had not prepared him for the way she entered the room, not like someone who had been away and was returning, but like someone stepping back into a building they had designed. She looked at the chamber with the slow, thorough attention of someone conducting an inspection. She sat in the seat that used to belong to the human delegation. The nameplate had been removed. She didn't seem to notice or didn't seem to care. Counselor Dehan was already at the presiding position. She looked at Moss the way you look at a dead planet on a scanner and discover it has an atmosphere. Dr. Moss, she said. Counselor Dehan, said Moss, you look well, a beat. I know what you're going to ask. Let me save us both some time. She folded her hands on the desk in front of her. The Council voted to exile humanity 41 years ago on 3 grounds: cultural contamination risk, failure to comply with behavioral standardization protocols, and the one that was never officially stated in the record, the fact that several of your member species found human psychological variants threatening to what you called galactic stability. She said this the way you state a mathematical proof. Those were the real reasons. The formal charges were the container, not the contents. Dehan said nothing. I understand, said Moss, is not the same as I agree. The room processed this. What do you want? Dehan said finally. To judge you, said Moss, in the same room with the same gavel. She looked at the bone object at the center of the desk. Would you like to know what that's made of? The silence that followed was not comfortable. It had the quality of a structural sound, the kind of quiet that means something load-bearing has shifted. Valoran had attended diplomatic sessions where revelations occurred. He had watched species learn things that changed their strategic position permanently. He had seen delegations receive intelligence that rendered previous decisions catastrophically wrong. What he had never seen before was an entire chamber of experienced diplomatic actors simultaneously realize they were in a position they had not chosen and could not immediately map. Dehan's voice, when she used it, was very controlled. The gavel is ceremonial. It has been used in council proceedings since the founding accord, said Moss. Yes, I know the official history. She didn't raise her voice. I also know what the founding accord doesn't mention, which species provided the material, and why they agreed to provide it, and what the agreement cost them. She looked around the chamber slowly, making eye contact with specific delegations in a sequence that was clearly not random. Some of you know this already. Most of you were told it was irrelevant to current proceedings. You were told a lot of things about the past that were framed as irrelevant. She turned back to Dehan. That reframing is what we're here to address. You cannot simply, began one of the Dravathi senior delegates. Call a session of judgment. We just did. Soren Moss, standing to the right of Ilara, produced a data tablet and placed it on the nearest council interface. We've filed the formal petition under Article 12 of the Founding Accord, the article that allows any registered sentient species to bring a complaint of systemic harm against the Council as a governing body. He waited. "We re-registered this morning. The system accepted it. You can check." Another pause. "We thought you might have removed the article entirely. We were prepared for that. But you didn't, because removing it would have required acknowledging it existed, and acknowledging it existed would have required explaining to your own member species why you wanted to remove it." The Quas delegate who had spoken to the gray-haired human in the corridor was staring at Soren with an expression Valoran had learned to read across several species. It was the expression of someone recalculating everything. Article 12 requires a petitioning species to demonstrate continuous organized governance during the period of grievance, said Dihan. She was not reading from a reference, she knew the text. This meant she had reviewed it recently, which meant someone in her office had anticipated this possibility. Humanity was stripped of governance recognition. Humanity was stripped of council-recognized * governance recognition, said Alara Moss. There's a distinction. The article's language is older than the Council's current governance definition protocols. Considerably older. She let that sit. We've had 41 years to read very carefully. This was the moment Valoran would later identify as the point where his understanding of the previous 4 decades inverted completely. He had spent those years thinking of the exile as something that had happened to humanity. An action taken by the Council, received by humans, weathered by humans, survived somehow, impossibly by humans. A passive experience, something endured. What the evidence now suggested was that the exile had been, in some sense the Council had never intended, a choice. Not chosen before the fact. Humanity had not engineered its own exile. But somewhere in those 11 seconds of silence before Alara Moss said, "We understand," the calculus had shifted. And what she had understood, what she had assessed in 11 seconds with the entire Galactic Council watching, was not simply the terms of the verdict. She had assessed the Council itself. She had looked at 7 species with their hands raised and seen not just what they were doing, but why. Not just the surface action, but the underlying architecture of assumption and precedent and political arrangement that had made the vote possible. She had understood, specifically, what the Council believed about human limitations. And she had decided to let them believe it. For 41 years. "You could have appealed," said Valoran. He said it before he'd made a decision to speak, the thought arriving fully formed as words. The chamber turned toward him. He was not in a speaking position. He was a senior observer. He spoke anyway. At any point in the first decade, the appeal process was still technically available. Procedure requires a petition within 30 years of judgment, and "We knew," said Moss. "Then why?" "Because an appeal would have required us to argue within the system." She looked at him with something that was not quite kindness and not quite pity but existed in the space between them. And the system was the problem. A pause. You can't prove a structure is compromised from inside the structure. You can only demonstrate it from outside. We needed to be outside. We needed 41 years and a position the Council had never imagined we could reach. She glanced at the gavel again. "We needed to know what that's made of." "What is it made of?" said Valoran. "The bones of a founding species," she said. "The Varath. You have them listed in your historical records as a species that declined into voluntary dissolution 600 years ago, chose to end their civilization peacefully, integrated their remaining population into Council territories." She watched the chamber. Several delegates had gone very still. "That's not what happened. The dissolution wasn't voluntary. The Varath refused a Council directive, a different kind of behavioral standardization, much older than the protocol used on us, and they were exiled. And when they appealed, the appeal process they relied on didn't function the way the Accord described, because the Accord had been amended, quietly, retroactively, and the record had been managed. Her voice didn't change register. The gavel is a trophy, not a ceremonial object. It was made from Varath remains, by the presiding body that authorized their destruction. and placed at the center of every council session since. And every species that has stood in this chamber for the last 600 years has stood in front of it without knowing what they were looking at. The room was silent. "We are not the first species this was done to," said Moss. "We are the first species that survived it, documented it, and came back." Fleet Commander Rethanoa's hand moved. Not toward a weapon. There were no weapons in the chamber. That was a foundational protocol. Toward his communication interface. Valoran watched him stop mid-motion and visibly reconsider, because the question of who to contact and what to say and how to say it without making the situation worse was a calculation that, for the first time in Rethanoa's career, did not resolve cleanly. This, Valoran thought, was what the humans had been counting on. Not chaos, not the Council's incapacity. The opposite, the Council's profound competence at self-preservation, its deeply developed instinct for managing information, its institutional expertise at recognizing when a situation had moved beyond the point where force was the efficient response. The humans had not arrived with weapons. They had arrived with documentation, with legal precision, with Article 12 filed correctly in a system the Council itself maintained, with a claim so specifically constructed that rejecting it publicly would require admitting the framework it relied on was fraudulent, which would require explaining the Verath, which would require the Council to become the thing it had spent 600 years presenting itself as the solution to. They were trapped, not by the humans' power, by their own. "The documentation is being reviewed," said Dihan, finally. Her voice was the flattest Valoran had ever heard it. Flat in the way that means everything is being held in place by very deliberate effort. "Under standard procedure, we would convene a review committee." "We're aware of standard procedure," said Soren Moss. "We've also documented the outcomes of review committees convened for species-level grievances over the last 600 years. The success rate for petitioning species is," he checked the tablet, though Valoran suspected he knew the number already, 0. Every case referred to committee was tabled, reclassified, or closed on procedural grounds. "We don't want a committee." He looked up. "We want a direct session, open record, with representatives from every member species present, including the 17 that were admitted after our exile and have never been told the Council's founding history is incomplete." "That's not," began someone. "Possible," said Alara Moss, "under current procedure." "Silence." "We've already sent the session invitation," said Soren. 43 minutes ago before we docked. Direct transmission to all member species home systems, not filtered through the Council relay. They should be receiving it now." He put down the tablet. "We borrowed the transmission frequency, the one the Council retired when it scrubbed our registry record. Turns out when you retire a frequency rather than decommissioning it, the underlying infrastructure stays active. We've been using it for 31 years. He let that land. "You've been broadcasting on a channel you thought was dead. We've heard everything." The chamber erupted. Not in violence, the acoustics damped the sound, as designed, but in the controlled chaos of 20 delegations receiving the same information at the same time through their personal interfaces and reacting with the full weight of what it meant. 31 years of Council communications, every closed session, every private directive, every strategic discussion held on a frequency assumed to be secured by its own obsolescence. Valoran watched Dihan absorb this. He had served under Counselor Dihan for 11 years. He knew her the way you know anyone you've watched exercise power across a long enough period, not their surface presentation but their operational logic, the specific shape of how they made decisions. And what he saw in Dihan's face in that moment was not anger, not fear, not even the political calculation he expected. It was something he had no immediate framework for. He realized, with a slow dropping sensation, that he was watching a person who had done something she believed was necessary confront the possibility that the necessity had been constructed. "How many people know?" she said. She directed it at Moss, not at the chamber, as if they were the only two in the room. About the transmissions, everyone we needed to tell, about the Verath, our full population, plus the documentation we've transmitted to every non-council academic institution in registered space over the last 14 years. Moss met her eyes. It's already out. This session is not how it becomes known. This session is how the council decides what to do about the fact that it's already known. Dehan was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something Vay Lauren had never heard her say in 30 years of sessions. What do you want from us? Not what are your terms, not what will it take to resolve this. What do you want? As a genuine question, from one being to another. Alara Moss looked at the gavel, really looked at it, the way she'd been looking at it since she entered the room, with the specific quality of attention you give to something you've spent a very long time thinking about. A funeral, she said. The word moved through the chamber the way very simple things sometimes do in complex environments, with too much force for its size. For the Verath, said Moss, a real one, not a reclassification, not an amended historical record with new language that technically says something different while functionally saying the same thing. A funeral, open record, every species present, an accounting of what they were, what was done to them, and an explicit statement that what was done was wrong. She looked away from the gavel. And then we need to talk about the 17 species that have been in this chamber without knowing where they're sitting or what they've been governed by. Her voice was still even. Because those species deserve to make decisions about their membership based on accurate information. Some of them will leave. You should be prepared for that. And humanity, said Vay Lauren. He asked it before anyone else could shape the question, before it could be translated into political language. What does humanity want for itself? Moss looked at him. It was the first time she'd focused on him directly, and he became aware of what the bioscan numbers had failed to fully convey. She was not young. She was not old. She existed in some register of human physiological possibility that the Council's medical models had apparently not mapped. Her eyes, in particular, had a quality that was difficult to articulate, not wisdom exactly, though it resembled it. Something more like the specific kind of patience that can only grow from having been willing to wait without knowing the outcome. To sit in this chamber again, she said, as something the Council didn't define and can't rescind. We're not applying for remembership. We're informing you that we're members, because humanity has met every criterion the original Accord describes, and the exile was imposed on fraudulent grounds, and the Accord's own language makes the exile retroactively void. A pause. We've had very good lawyers for 41 years. We had a lot of time to prepare. If the Council doesn't accept this, said Rethenoa, then we go to the species we've already contacted. The 17 new members, the 17 old members who we have documentation on regarding decisions made without their full knowledge, the academic institutions, the independent stations. Soren's voice was not aggressive. It had the quality of someone reading from a maintenance schedule. We've built a coalition, not an armed one. We've built it from every species that this council has failed to give accurate information to. That's more than you'd think. He let out a breath that was the closest thing to emotion he'd shown since the airlock. We didn't want to use it. We'd prefer not to use it. We'd prefer this room. He looked around the chamber. We'd prefer that you choose to be what you told everyone you were. The session lasted 19 hours. Vay Lauren stayed for all of it. He wasn't required to. His role was observational, and the formal proceedings quickly moved beyond anything his usual function covered. He stayed because he was watching something he did not have the right category for, and he was not willing to stop watching until he understood it or admitted that he couldn't. The first 3 hours were procedural crisis, legal challenges to Article 12's applicability, procedural motions to delay formal recognition. The humans responded to each one with specific text references and case precedents they'd clearly prepared, and the Council's legal division, working at emergency speed in a side room, kept finding that the human legal team's reading was not only defensible, but in several cases was the most textually accurate interpretation of the original Accord language. Because the original Accord language was very old, and humanity had read it very carefully in conditions where they had nothing else to rely on. The fourth hour was when the first old member delegation formally requested a pause to review the Verath documentation. The eighth hour was when the first new member delegation transmitted a message to their home system marked as urgent. The 12th hour was when Counselor Dehan called a private recess and walked out of the chamber with 3 senior staff members, and Valoran watched her walk past him without acknowledgement, which told him the calculation had entered a new phase. He found himself standing near Alara Moss during the recess. She was holding a cup of something, one of the human dietary requirements the receiving team had apparently anticipated, because there was a small service table near the human delegation's area that hadn't been there before they arrived. Steam rose from the cup. She was watching the chamber the way she'd watched it all session, with that quality of attention that was not performance. "You planned every part of this," Valoran said, "including which questions would be asked first, including which delegations would break in which order. You've been modeling this session since the ship left Earth," she said, "and modeling the Council's legal position since about year 3 of the exile." She sipped from the cup. "We had time." 41 years. 41 years. She didn't say it as a complaint. She said it the way you say a distance you've already covered. "Do you know what's strange about exile? What they never tell you." She looked at him. "You expect it to break something. Everyone expects it to. Every civilization that has ever imposed exile on another species, your historical records are full of it, they all assume the same thing. That isolation is desolating. That being removed from the galactic community means diminishing. Getting smaller, losing cohesion, losing purpose." She turned the cup slowly in her hands. "We got smaller on the outside. Every external measure of human presence in registered space went to zero. Our colonial footprints in the places you could see gone. Our diplomatic presence gone. Our economic participation in your systems gone." A pause. "We went inward, completely inward. For a species that you had categorized as chaotic, externally focused, behaviorally unstandardized, something crossed her face that was not quite a smile. We discovered that what looked like chaos from outside was actually compression. Everything you found threatening about human behavior, every variance, every unpredictability, it wasn't random. We just weren't ever given a reason to direct it in a single direction at the same time." She looked at the gavel. "You gave us one." Valoran was quiet. "The Drevathi delegate," he said finally. "The one who first asked about clones. She's going to file for a complete biological review. She's going to try to demonstrate that you're not the same individuals identified in the original exile record, that the re-registration is therefore based on a fraudulent identity claim." "Yes," Moss nodded. "We prepared for that." "How?" She reached into her jacket and placed something on the table beside the service station. A small device, old, clearly old, physically aged in a way that matched the 41-year timeline. A recording unit of the type the Council had used before the current generation of translation arrays. "Because I recorded myself, every year, medical biometrics, a statement dated against 2 independent time references and a simple recording of my own face." She touched the device gently. "Every year for 41 years, stored in triplicate in facilities we can provide access to." She looked at him. "We anticipated the clone argument in year 2. We started preparing for it in year 2. We've been preparing for every argument in this room for nearly 40 years. A silence. "Valoran, how long do you think it takes a species to figure out what will and won't work in a system, if they have nothing to do but study that system?" He didn't answer. "The biological question," she said, "is legitimate, and the answer is genuinely strange, and I'm going to give it to the Drevathi delegate in writing because it deserves a full explanation rather than a session floor exchange." A pause. We learned things in the exile about human physiology, things we hadn't had the pressure to learn before, because when you're embedded in a functional galactic community, there's a ceiling on how hard you push. When you're alone and you know you'll need to come back and you're working on a timeline of decades rather than years, she stopped. The specific word in your medical taxonomy is asterisk senescence, cellular. We have a new relationship with it. It's not immortality. Don't mistake it for that. We still die. Several of the humans on this ship are going to die before this session ends, probably from other causes. Injury, organic failure, the usual catalog. Something in her voice shifted very slightly. We just stopped accepting that aging was fixed. How? She looked at the cup in her hands. The steam had stopped. By wanting to survive long enough to come back, she said, more than we accepted the alternative. Counselor Dehan returned to the chamber in the 15th hour. She sat at the presiding position for a long moment without reaching for the gavel. Then she turned to the nearest session coordinator and said, in a voice that carried to every occupied seat, "Remove the gavel from the chamber. Permanently. Flag it for the historical review that will be conducted as part of the Verath proceeding." The coordinator hesitated for exactly 1 second, then reached forward and picked it up. Every delegation watched it leave the room. Dehan looked at Alara Moss. "The Council will recognize humanity's petition under Article 12, she said. "The legal committee has determined, and I'm saying this on open record, that the original exile resolution contained procedural irregularities sufficient to render it challengeable. We are not conceding that it was fraudulent. We are conceding that it is being contested on grounds the Council cannot immediately dismiss, and that the appropriate response is to admit the question and open a formal proceeding." A pause. "That's the most I can give you tonight." "I know," said Moss. "The Verath proceeding will require." "I know what it will require. We've drafted the framework. Soren will provide it to your legal team." Dehan looked at her. The look lasted several seconds longer than anything Vey Lauren had observed from Dehan in 30 years of watching her exercise power. Then she said, very quietly, something the translation arrays barely caught. "You could have destroyed us. The information you have, if you'd transmitted everything to every species simultaneously rather than coming here first." "Yes," said Moss. "Why didn't you?" Moss was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. "Because destruction is easy," she said. "It doesn't require patience or precision or 41 years of sustained direction. Any species with sufficient grievance can destroy. We wanted something harder." She looked at the empty space where the gavel had been. "We wanted you to choose to be better than you were, because if you don't choose it, it doesn't hold. We'd come back in 41 more years to the same room with the same problem." She looked at Dehan directly. "We don't have infinite patience, even us." The chamber was very quiet. Valoran found himself looking at the empty space too. The absence of the bone object was a different kind of presence, visible precisely because it had always been there, because the desk had a specific mark where it had rested for 600 years, and the mark was now just a mark, without its explanation, and the explanation was sitting in a review file that would eventually require every species in the galaxy to confront what they had governed themselves by without knowing it. He thought about 11 seconds. About a woman standing at a podium with the entire Galactic Council watching and deciding, in 11 seconds, to say we understand instead of we object, and what it meant that the most sophisticated diplomatic body in known space had heard asterisk surrender, and she had meant we see exactly what you are, and we will remember it, and we will be back. He thought about the frequency. Retired, not decommissioned. 31 years of signal, passing through infrastructure the Council maintained and assumed was silent. The waste of assumptions. The specific cost of believing that a species removed from your visibility had also been removed from existence. He thought about bone, and what the decision to use it revealed about the people who had made it, not as cruelty, but as comfort, A daily reminder in a room full of power that power had already made this particular choice before and found it easy. He thought about everything humanity had lost in 41 years. The colonies in the visible systems abandoned fast. The diplomatic presences vanished overnight. The economic footholds surrendered without negotiation. He had always read this as evidence of collapse. Now he read it as evidence of speed. Move fast. Go inward. Don't let them see where you're going. Everything that looked like defeat from inside the Council's view had been a reorientation. A species compressing itself to a point, gathering, directing. They had not survived the exile. They had used it. The formal proceedings would take another 3 years. The Verath recognition was the longest part, not because the evidence was insufficient, but because the implications were extensive, touching the legitimacy of 60 years of council decisions made with the founding gavel present as a symbol of authority. 11 species requested independent historical audits of their own membership circumstances. 3 requested mediated review of specific directives that had been issued without full disclosure to their home governments. 1 species, the Surathvel, Dihan's own, voted internally to suspend its council representation pending the audit's completion. Humanity sat in the chamber for all of it. Not as the accused, not as petitioners, as members, recognized, reseated, formally restored under the language of the founding accord that had existed for 600 years without being used for this purpose, because no species had ever survived an exile long enough to invoke it, or arrived back with the specific kind of preparation that made invocation possible. Soren Moss, in an interview with a Dravathi journalist 8 months into the proceedings, was asked what the hardest part of the exile had been. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, knowing we couldn't tell you what we were doing, knowing you'd see the silence and read it as defeat, we needed you to believe it. He paused. Some of us believed it too at the beginning. That's the part no one talks about. The exile didn't break the species, but it broke a lot of people, individual people. People who didn't live to see this. His voice didn't crack, but it did something. We're here for them too, not just for the ones who made it. Alara Moss never gave another interview. She appeared at proceedings when required, submitted documentation, responded to legal queries with the precision of someone who had expected every one of them. Occasionally, Ve Lauren would see her in the corridors between sessions, moving with the unhurried quality of someone who had learned to think in decades rather than days. Once, near the end of the 2nd year, he passed her standing in Corridor 7, the berth where their ship was still docked. She was looking at the outer viewport, at the stars, technically, but with the expression of someone looking at something closer, something internal. He stopped. She didn't turn, but he knew she was aware of him. The Dravathi delegate still doesn't understand the aging, he said. She's read the documentation 3 times. She says the mechanism isn't. It's not supposed to be understandable yet, said Moss. We're still understanding it ourselves. She was quiet. It wasn't a technology. We didn't invent something. We just stopped dying at the rate we expected to. When you need to be alive for something specific enough, and the need is collective enough and long enough, she stopped. It's not a clean mechanism. It doesn't work the same way in everyone. Some of the people on this ship are going to live for 200 more years. Some are going to die in the next 5. We don't know which is which yet. Her voice was even. We accepted the variance. We accepted not knowing. We just refused to accept that we wouldn't be here long enough to see this. Ve Lauren looked at the stars through the viewport. He tried to find the language for what he was experiencing, and found it kept slipping. He had spent 41 years in a chamber that contained a trophy made of extinct bones, presiding over the governance of hundreds of species, and he had not known, and he had thought the not knowing was simply the nature of gaps in historical record, the natural erosion of 600-year-old context. He had not considered that the not knowing was a decision, made by specific beings, maintained by specific systems, passed down in the same quiet way that all the most dangerous assumptions are passed down, as furniture, as context, as the shape of the room you sit in every day without asking why the room was built that way. He had not considered that somewhere, in a system the Council had marked as exiled and moved on from, a species that the galaxy had categorized as too chaotic, too variable, too psychologically unpredictable for standard galactic participation, had spent 4 decades doing nothing but asking why the room was built that way. And finding out. And coming back to say so, with documentation, with legal precision, with 43 humans on a single vessel and a 4-word message on a dead frequency, and enough patience to wait until the moment when the question could not be dismissed. The strongest species in the galaxy were the ones with the largest fleets, the most sophisticated weapons platforms, the longest institutional memory, the most developed capacity for projecting force across interstellar distances. The Galactic Council had been built on this understanding, had been governed by it, had used it to draw the lines between order and disruption, between standard and deviant, between the species that belonged in the room and the species that threatened it. Humanity had none of those things. Humanity had been stripped of its presence, its registry, its colonies, its embassy seals, its recognized governance. Humanity had been given nothing but time and a reason. That, it turned out, was the one thing the Council had never learned to account for. Because every other species, at some point in the face of extinction or exile or the complete erasure of their galactic standing, had eventually stopped, had calculated the cost, had looked at what remained and concluded the remainder was insufficient, had accepted the logic of the situation. Humanity had looked at the logic of the situation, said we understand, and spent 41 years building something the logic said was impossible, not because they didn't understand the logic, but because they had never, in the entire documented history of their species, accepted that what was logical was the same as what was final. The galaxy had exiled them for being too human. They had come back more human than they had ever been. And in the empty space where a bone gavel used to sit, in the slight mark on the presiding desk that 600 years of use had left behind, the galaxy was beginning, slowly, with the particular difficulty of large institutions confronting the specific shape of their own history, to understand what that meant.